Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Heinrich Heine's poem, The Silesian Weavers, which I'm reading out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. So this is a political protest poem by somebody who was left-leaning, maybe anarcho-socialist, possibly. Although I'm not sure that Heine's political ideas necessarily map clearly onto a simple and easy label. He was a friend of Marx, Karl Marx, according to the Norton introduction, though he wasn't a communist per se. But somewhat later in his life, starting around 1840. So he was born in 1797 and he died in 1856. So in the last 15, 16 years of his life, Heine allowed his poetry to shift away from romanticism and toward more political themes. And the Silesian Weavers is in that tradition. It is about a there's a group of Prussian weavers whose wages had been severely cut, and they launched a protest about it. And Heine wrote this poem in commemoration of that protest. Basically, the slogan of the poem might be the great anarchist slogan, "No gods, no masters." This is very, very much about drawing attention to the sufferings of the poor and the ways in which they are exploited by the state, by the nation as an entity, by the monarchy and aristocracy, as well as by religion and by capitalism. So it's a sort of comprehensive, again, I would say anarcho-socialist type critique of the system that exploits the value of labor. So we start out with this stanza. In somber eyes, no tears of grieving, grinding their teeth, they sit at their weaving. O Germany, at your shroud we sit, we're weaving a threefold curse in it. We're weaving, we're weaving. And so one of the things that we get actually is that at the end of each stanza, we have that repetition, we're weaving, we're weaving. It becomes a through thread. If we want to accept this metaphor, or the simile, rather, if we want to accept this simile, it is like weaving a pattern into cloth. There is a regularity to both the meter, the rhyme scheme, and the final line of each stanza. So we have an we have an AABB rhyme scheme for each stanza, and then the final line, which in the first stanza, it's AABBA, but that's sort of incidental. That's not the regular rhyme scheme. So we have what are called heroic couplets here, or rhymed couplets. Each stanza has this regular pattern, the way that you would put a regular pattern into woven cloth if you are weaving it. You want there to be regularity, consistency, and uniformity. And so in this sense, I mean, this is standard poetic stuff. Heine is a late 18th, early 19th century poet. Poetry was done with rhyme schemes. It was done with regular meter. And so this isn't unusual, but given the subject matter, given that it is about a protest by weavers, you can see that the connection between form and function here. The poem itself is structured like a regularly woven piece of cloth. There is a repeating pattern to it. So that's kind of an interesting element here. But also in this first stanza, if we turn to the content of it, again, O Germany, at your shroud we sit, we're weaving a threefold curse in it. This condemnation of country, of nation, of state. Because again, these are exploited workers. These are people who their labor goes to, on some level, benefit the nation. Because to a certain extent, all labor ends up benefiting the nation within an integrated economy, the kind that was developing in an industrializing state like early 19th century Prussia. So we have that element, this critique of how labor is, from the perspective of the emerging capitalist nation state, modern capitalist nation state, labor is disposable. Then we have this next stanza. A curse on the God we prayed to, kneeling with cold in our bones, with hunger reeling. We waited and hoped, in vain preserved. He scorned us and duped us, mocked and jeered. We're weaving, we're weaving. And so, again, we have this idea that religion was supposed to offer some sort of salvation. It was supposed to, in some way, it was supposed to offer an escape from the suffering of the world. And it hasn't. It doesn't fulfill that promise. At least not in any tangible, measurable way. The poor continue to suffer despite the idea that religion is supposed to offer some kind of comfort. And so we have that, no gods, no masters. The next stanza takes us directly to the monarchy and the feudal order. A curse on the king of the rich man's nation, who hardens his heart at our supplication, who wrings the last penny out of our hides and lets us be shot like dogs besides. We're weaving, we're weaving. Again, the early 19th century is this weird time in Northern Europe and Western Europe, in Britain, France, Prussia, these kinds of countries, because you have the emerging capitalist class that is rising to prominence within the new nation-state structure, replacing the older feudal structure, the kingdom structure. And yet the aristocracy, the monarchy, those with traditional feudal power, still play this really important role within society. And it's a role in which they are actually in conflict with the bourgeoisie, which is the term that Marx uses to describe the emerging, not necessarily middle classes as such, not in the way that we think of middle classes today, but the wealthy capitalists who own the means of production, but are not part of the aristocracy. So the bourgeoisie is really kind of in between, and then there's what we would today tend more to think of as the middle class, sort of petit bourgeoisie. Anyway, the bourgeoisie is the emerging powerful class within society because they have a lot of money and they have control over things like the means of production, how industry functions. They are in the process at this point of replacing the feudal aristocracy, who are a little bit of a holdover from an earlier system. However, the power of the state and the power of the monarchy often goes to support the bourgeoisie, because even though the feudal aristocracy and the bourgeoisie recognize that their class interests are not the same, they also recognize they have a shared class interest in keeping the poor, the working class, the proletariat in Marxist terms, or agricultural laborers repressed. And so you have this merging of the power of the state, which is often still at this point embodied in the monarchy, with the class interests of the bourgeoisie against the class interests of workers. Workers broadly conceived, both to include industrial labor, but also to include agricultural labor, peasants, and people like this. And so again, you've got these intersections within the poem. We again then return to the critique of the nation. In this case, a little bit more abstractly. The idea of the fatherland, the idea of the nation as sort of mythical home of the Volk, the people in sort of German culture. Volk is the term commonly used. This sort of abstract sense of belonging within a cultural space, homeness, not in the sense of like an individual home, but like home as a community. So we have this stanza: a curse on this false fatherland, teeming with nothing but shame and dirty scheming, where every flower is crushed in a day, where worms are regaled on rot and decay, we're weaving. So again, this idea that like, there was supposed to be this community. We were supposed to have a home for ourselves as a people, and we don't. It is a lie as much as the monarchy or religion or the emerging capitalist nation state. And then finally, we actually turn to labor itself, to the work of these weavers. The shuttle flies, the loom creaks loud, night and day we weave your shroud, old Germany, at your shroud we sit, we're weaving a threefold curse in it. We're weaving. And so again, though each stanza, I think it's worth pointing out, does end with we're weaving. And I talked about that before in terms of the sort of pattern to weaving cloth, the way that you put in a regular pattern of threads in relation to one another. It's also worth noting that repetition of we're weaving is the sort of monotonous, repetitive work that characterizes especially the early phases of the Industrial Revolution, in which one does the same task over and over and over again. And that repetition draws our attention to the structure of labor as such, that repeated quality of doing work like weaving.